Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. You're not good enough. You need to try harder. You'll never keep up. There isn't enough time. These are the sorts of voices that can hum just beneath the surface of our minds, pushing us to act in unsustainable and frantic ways. So many of us long for the peace that comes with a life marked by internal calm and groundedness, but we feel gripped by anxiety. We don't know what to do with these unhelpful thoughts circling within. They seem very real and they feel like truth. How do we make sense of these narratives? And how do we settle enough to hear God's voice? An important part of growing in self-awareness is learning how to make sense of these competing voices. That's what author and spiritual director Gem Fadling and I talk about today. Gem brings decades of wisdom and personal experience to this conversation as she teaches us how to identify these voices, slow our internal pace, and notice, discern, and respond our way into greater wholeness. So let's go to my conversation now with Gem. Well, welcome to Faith and Feelings, Gem. I'm so glad you're here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This is great.
Well, this is one of several conversations that we've been having on the podcast all about self-awareness. And Gem, I have been so looking forward to our conversation today. So my mom introduced me to Unhurried Living a few years ago and recommended that I read your book, Hold That Thought. And it was really impactful for me.
Well, thanks so much. I'm really glad that you connected with it. And I so loved being with your mother. She's really a wonderful person.
I love her a lot too.
Yeah, she's amazing.
Yeah. Well, to start off, I'm curious to know how you would describe yourself when you weren't self-aware. So what are some words that you would use to describe yourself when you lacked self-awareness?
Yeah, as I thought about this, I realized, I'm still learning and growing, of course. But really, in the first half of my life, I would call myself actually quite unaware. And I would go so far as early in young adulthood and earlier, I would just call myself naive. Just very naive, just not aware of a lot of things, just kind of careening through life. I had a great life, a great upbringing in a small town in Washington. But before I was self-aware, I would say I was sort of run by naivete, maybe even just not knowing a lot of things, not knowing about a lot of things. I would also say I was run by anxiety. Anxiety. I remember when I was much younger, 40 years ago probably, I really thought that I would never, ever, ever be able to get a handle on how anxious I was. And I lived with that for a long time before I found some freedom. So anyway, maybe one other thing I could add is that maybe this is just another way of saying the same thing. I was kind of blissfully unaware, kind of a positive thinker, but too far over to the side. Maybe.
Yeah. So what began to change?
Well, it's interesting because my relationship with God and my spirituality has everything to do with my becoming more self-aware.
Yeah.
Which is probably not surprising, right? I probably could have taken a journey like this anyway, but I am a follower of Jesus. And so placing myself in his care and being open and aware and willing in God's presence, I think opened some doors for me. I was in my mid to late 20s, and my husband and I, we met these men. They became mentors to us. And one of them introduced me to silence and solitude. And I was 26.
Okay. I'm 26 right now.
Yay. I was your age.
Yeah.
And that's when I first understood, someone taught me what solitude and silence is. It sounds like this very, oh my goodness, what's silence and solitude? But it's really just setting aside some unhurried time to be in God's presence in receptive mode as opposed to productive mode. Now, that doesn't mean you can't read your Bible or, worship with some worship music or whatever it is you want to do, but the posture is more of listening, right? And so even at that young age, I understood it as much as I could. And he would give us assignments like just go out for an hour every month. Start with an hour once a month, which I was like, I can do that. That's not a ton. And just listen. And so at a very young age, I started listening, which meant I started hearing. And I remember very early on asking God, I said, show me who you really are. Because even at that point, I'd been a Christian for a few years. I'd been in church. I was already at that point where I was yearning for more, whatever that meant to me at the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I feel like God really answered that. So when I say, show me who you really are, I feel like God not only started to show me who he was in greater depths for the season of life that I was in, but he also started to show me who I was, which makes sense, right? Because he's journeying with me. And I think that's when the doors of my self-awareness it opened and I was on a different journey.
I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about what that journey looked like. How did you begin to grow or change as you walked that journey?
Yeah, well, I suppose it was just the slow and steady process and progress of those kinds of spiritual practices building on each other. As much as I said I was naive, it makes me sound like I was dumb. I don't think naive means dumb. I've always been a good student. I've always been a voracious learner, and a grower, right? So I'm active and I do care about my growth. It's just that I spent a lot of my growing up years just being naive and anxious, which in their own way feel like a little bit of a damper on things, right? But God just really opened me up in a new way where I became more curious. I learned a little bit more about what presence was. Fast forward, 15 years after that, now I'm in my early 40s and I'm really learning about presence because then I was studying to become a spiritual director. And that's all about presence and focus and listening. So the thing here is there are skills you can learn, of course, but I think there's also a posture that you can have in your life. How much of God do you desire? What are you willing to do so that you can be who God made you to be? Right? And so no matter what I've done in my life, I've had all different kinds of seasons, motherhood and working part-time, working full-time, and all the different things. But there's always been this through line of what God is doing in my life. And so I'm wondering, I don't know if your listeners, I assume your listeners know what I'm talking about. We all have a prayer life, right?
Yeah.
And we do our best to understand what we perceive God is leading us into. We use our best kind of discernment muscles. So I just was doing that all along the way and trying to draw the connections between what I sensed was happening in my heart and what I could see God was doing in my outer life. So maybe that's the beginnings of an answer.
Yeah. As you've been on this journey, what have been some obstacles? Where have you gotten stuck?
Yeah. So I would say, again, first half of life would have been ignorance. Second half of life, midlife especially, I think it was just that I started to hit stuff that was like beyond my pay grade.
Okay.
I mean, midlife is just its own animal, and that can happen. I mean, midlife can happen anywhere from 35 to 55. And I've heard some people say that even these days, people are hitting midlife type things even earlier than 35, just because of how fast paced the world is and how much information we get. But regardless, I would say that I felt stuck at certain points in midlife until I started therapy, which I know you're a proponent of.
Yes.
I needed help. I needed help to learn more. I needed help to overcome, as I mentioned, my anxiety. I had a spiritual director. I just got a lot of help. So when I got stuck, or when I knew I was stuck and when I needed help, then I sought help. And I think that's important. And I think actually even now, people are even more open to getting help. Do you think?
Yeah, I think so.
Maybe more open to talking about these things. Like my parents' generation wouldn't even talk about anything. If there was something going on psychologically or with your feelings or any kind of healing like that, my parents did not talk about that, but they were from a completely different generation. So that may or may not be why it took me so long to actually get the help I needed. But by the time I was the age I was, there was an openness and really a need. I needed help.
Yeah, I'm wondering, and you could say as much about this as you feel comfortable, but what are some things that you began to uncover or maybe unpack in those spaces? What did you begin to kind of discover about yourself?
Yeah. So to me, this is so fascinating just to watch how a human being transforms over time. Because again, by that time I'm 40, which means I have at least 40 years of life experience. So there was a level of maturity about me. Again, I was raising children. I had been married for almost 20 years at that point. And yet there were really young places inside of me, really wounded places inside of me. I've shared this before with other people on other platforms, but I had a really distressing relationship with my mom. And that was a big part of my anxiety, was just overcoming the way we related. She passed away when I was 31, which is quite young, but I was still left with the residue of how we related and how that kept me stunted in a way. And the patterns of anxiety that had built up over time were just something that I did not know how to manage. And so at that point, I just felt overwhelmed by anxiety. I hoped and believed that God would heal me through the excellence of the counselor that I had. He was an amazing therapist. He has since passed away, which is so sad because he was so gifted. But we just dug around for a few years until we uncovered every rock. And this is what I know about me during that time. I was willing to say anything or do anything or look at anything in order to be free. My yearning for freedom was at its peak. And so meeting in therapy and with the yearning for freedom that intense, I moved along because I wasn't trying to just talk forever and be in it. I was like, how can I be free of this anxiety? How can all my little people inside feel loved and cared for?
Yeah.
And, all of that. And we did it. It was so exciting when we were done because I felt like so many things blossomed. I had agency. I had confidence. My therapist would say, I found me.
Yeah.
Because I had been buried a little bit underneath my mom. And then I was buried a little bit actually under my husband as well, because that was just a pattern I brought into my marriage. And at that point, then I was able to come to sort of burst forth in a refreshed version of myself. It was really cool.
That's so good. Thank you for sharing that. One of the things I've been thinking about recently is how our journeys with self-awareness can so often be determined by our pace of life. So how has your pace of life impacted your journey with self-awareness? Do you have any stories or examples of this?
Well, I would say, again, you might hear me repeating myself a lot, but I think there's some real central themes here in this conversation. And pace of life, I have an organization called Unhurried Living, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we have to tell people often because they're not sure what we're talking about, or they think it's something that maybe it's not. But what we're talking about is we understand that people have busy lives. Everybody's busy. I have a calendar. It's got things, all the colors are on there, and I'm doing all the things. It's okay to have a busy life. What we're talking about is the state of your soul or your heart or your mind. That pace of life could be unhurried. Now, that might have an effect on your outer life. Maybe you're doing too much. We can all assess that here and there. But we have a lot to do. I get that. But we're talking about what's going on inside, in here. If you could see me, I'm pressing on my heart. And so, pace of life. There's a couple of conversations here. Of course, yes, we could talk about your outer life, but I want to talk about your inner life for a minute. When I talk about the practice of solitude, it's no different than going to a gym. right? You go to a gym to build your muscles, right? You do reps. If you're doing light weights like me, you start at 3 pounds, then 5 pounds, then 8 pounds, then 10 pounds, and you keep moving up as you build, hopefully, just some nice little biceps for a 60-year-old woman. All that to say, anybody who wants to get healthy, you have to do something, right? You got to walk or run or lift weights or eat well. There's things to do. It's no different for the soul, right? Solitude to me is Dallas Willard, one of my book mentors. He called it the queen of the disciplines. That's because solitude, it takes time. You're talking about pace of life. If you're going to engage in solitude, you got to decide that at the start, even just 5 minutes, 15 minutes, maybe an hour, that you have enough time for that. A lot of people have an built-in assumption that they don't have time for the really important things.
Yeah.
And maybe that's where the conversation begins. What do you think about time itself? And what do you think about your ability to manage your own time, to make choices? And then if you can get past that hurdle of, okay, I have enough time, then believing that there's a kind of pace inwardly that actually leads to greater productivity. Maybe we would use the word fruitfulness. The much fruit that lasts, that comes from John 15. So the pace of life matters. Because if you're busy and you're just getting stuff done, but a lot of it doesn't matter, then what's that? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's kind of like logical. Do you want to be the kind of person that lives a meaningful life, that lives a full life, a fruitful life, a joyful life, a loving life? These are different measurements than how much did I get done today. And pacing helps all of that happen for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I'm wondering if you could maybe give an example of some internal warning signs that you personally experience when your external pace of life is too fast.
Yeah. Well, I already told you I struggle with anxiety. It's still a struggle. It's not as voracious as it used to be. I catch myself faster. And so I don't spend, weeks, months, or whatever, rolling around in it unaware.
Yeah.
But it's not gone because life is hard and things come up and we get triggered. You can't help that, right? So if I notice my anxiety level rising, that's a sign. If I find myself tired, sometimes I didn't get good sleep. I get that. But sometimes you're tired because you're overthinking or overdoing. So over the course of my life, especially in this second half of life, I don't have a choice anymore. I have to pay attention to my body all the time because it is giving me cues all the time. It's very easy in the first half of life to ignore your body because you have a lot of energy and a lot of strength. It's just all built in. But once you get, especially for women, once you hit 50 and over, your body really just changes in a lot of ways. And so I've had to learn to really honor and respect the cues my body gives me. So my body talks to me in a lot of ways, a racing heart for anxiety, or a furrowed brow for too much thinking, or shoulders that are tight, right? Or an upset stomach because I'm fretting about something.
Yeah.
Right. Or just tired because I'm, either didn't sleep well or, doing too much, whatever. Our body is giving us clues. Now, some people are good at listening to that and some people aren't. And so maybe the invitation is pay attention because your body will tell you.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Your body will tell you when something is off kilter. And that's when it backs up to what I said before. Do you have a slow enough pace inside that you have the ability to pay attention to the cues that are already there? And then do you believe enough about time and space that you could make the choices that you need to make to become a healthier version of yourself so that you can actually do what you want to do with greater effectiveness? It's almost a math problem, but it's not because it's soul work.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. Why do you think it can be hard for so many of us to live an unhurried life?
Yeah, well, I think outwardly it's because we're swimming against the tide. I mean, you and I right now both live in North America, and there's a pacing here. There's a productivity bias. There's the work ethic. Everybody's praised for how much they're getting done. And that's certainly, there's nothing wrong with work. I work still. I'm saying there's an kind of an implicit sort of overlay that happens with that then that makes us driven, and we use certain measuring sticks measuring tapes, whatever, that are really drivers that are unhealthy. That's why I like to use words more like, do you want to live an effective life or a loving life or a fruitful life? That's different than how much are you getting done today or this week, right? So I think it's difficult because we're swimming against a really big tide, because all of the United States, in general, our culture has a really fast-paced vibe. There's a lot of expectations and demand for results, and we count things. And I know this because I visited a lot of other countries, and other people live different ways. They don't care about the clock as much, right? They don't have to be there on time. They'll say, I'll see you at lunch, and who knows when that is? I don't know, when the sun's in the middle of the sky. I'm just saying we rev. So I think that makes it really hard because it's the air we're breathing. And then inwardly, I would say another reason it's hard to live an unhurried life, because we're also swimming against our own issues. For me, again, it was anxiety, but it might be denial, might be pride. I mean, whatever your issue is, you're also swimming against that. And so you're swimming against the culture, you're swimming against your own dynamics. And so it makes it very hard. You know, some people think that spiritual practices are all these lovey-dovey little Zen, like, oh, I'm just so relaxed. But I would argue that it's hard work, because it's swimming against the tide. And people aren't stopping for a reason. It's because it's hard. You might have to hear something or see something or feel something or think something, right? And not everybody wants to do that.
Yeah, that's good. You know, one of the things I've been thinking about is that when we slow our pace, we have a greater capacity to bring more of ourselves into the present moment, and we open up the possibility of encountering God more fully. But when we do this, we also open up the possibility of encountering the reality of ourselves more fully. And like you just said, what comes to the surface of our minds and souls in slowness and quiet can sometimes be so painful. So what often comes up for you internally when you practice slowing your pace?
Yeah, well, at first, so for example, as I told you, my husband and I have been practicing this for many, many years. And now we're older and we set our own schedule. We have our own organization. So quarterly, we take a 24-hour retreat day. We go to a retreat center down the freeway from us. And we basically call it a silent 24 hours, except we talk at meals, but we don't talk in between. We have our own rooms. We're with God. And there's beautiful grounds. So we do all these things. So normally when I set aside time like that, it takes actually a while. And whether you have an hour or 24 hours, a good portion of the first part of you setting aside that time is you're just going to feel a flutter. Your brain is just firing and thinking and worry, right? And you think, oh my gosh, I'm failing at solitude because I can't. But this is completely normal. Yeah. And I think I just want to make sure you understand. You don't just sit down and then everything's okay because you've been revving.
Yeah.
And so what comes up first for me is that my body, my brain, my heart, it's all just vibrating. And so I know that when I go for this 24 hours, that it's probably going to take me, we get there usually a couple hours for dinner. It's going to take me at least that through dinner, even into the evening, before I can start to feel like my parts are relaxing. And honestly, I usually don't feel like I've kicked in. Again, now this is for a 24-hour period. There's a mini version of that if you've given yourself an hour. But for me, when I go on this 24-hour, we get there at 3:00, and by the time I go to bed at 8 or 9, I've relaxed some, but I know the fullness of the sensation of being downshifted isn't going to hit me until the morning. And so I think it's good to mention that only because you don't have to have your expectations. Now, if you set aside an hour, it might take you 20, 30 minutes, maybe even the first half. If you've taken yourself to a beautiful location, you're walking in a park, or maybe you're sitting at the beach in a chair. I don't know what you're going to do. But maybe 20, 30 minutes for you to even just allow the dust to settle.
Yeah.
Because what comes up first is just all the fluff. And for me specifically, again, it would be a revving, it would be an anxiety. Usually what pops in there too is some version of discontent. I'm always like, something's not right, or something else needs to be happening, or what's next? these kinds of thoughts rev, and it'll be different for different people. So maybe I'm answering that question, but I think I'm also maybe answering a question you didn't ask, which is to give yourself the space and grace to ease into if you decide to give yourself some unhurried time. A lot of things will pop up, and it's absolutely normal, and it's absolutely okay, and it will settle over time if you keep practicing.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. Anxiety has also been a pretty big theme in my life. And I'm thinking about this one morning. I think it was my freshman year of college that I was in a session with my therapist. And I remember it was as soon as I walked into her office, I sat down on her couch and burst into tears. And she sat down with me and we began talking about how my external pace of life was fueling my anxiety. And I remember her telling me something like, "You've got to slow down, Taylor. Your pace of life is fueling your anxiety." And I looked at her and it was like these words were out of my mouth before I even knew what I was saying. I said, "I can't slow down. My anxiety will catch up with me." Yes. And she looked at me and I looked at her and we kind of just stared at each other for a minute. And then we started processing what I had just said. And I began to realize how often I use my external pace as a coping mechanism. I try to run away from my anxiety, run away from my feelings, run away from my inner critic. And I think that is part of the reason why your book, Hold That Thought, resonated so much with me, because you talk about what it looks like to sort through those competing voices in our minds and that inner chatter that can kind of explode in quiet, and that we can also try to run away from in the busyness of everyday life. So can you share some of what you've learned about making sense of these inner voices?
Yeah, thanks for sharing your story. Oh my goodness. Yeah, it's just to say something about that first.
Yeah.
It is, you're describing perfectly what I mean. There's a step before moving into presence practices, which is, am I willing to look at what comes up? Or, and I didn't say solve or fix or manage, but am I willing to just see it?
Yeah.
And if you can say yes to that kind of at any level, yeah, I'm willing to see it. That can help, because it really does take, because another thing I like to talk about is reflection. And reflection doesn't happen fast. In order to take things deeper, you kind of have to look back and go, well, what happened here? Reflecting on it takes the learning deeper, and that takes that pace as well. But coming back to Hold That Thought, really the impetus for that was the verse that says, "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind." What does that even look like? So it's sort of my best effort at taking a stab. It's not the stab, but how would you cooperate with God? Because it says be transformed, which means I'm being transformed, right? How would I cooperate with that process? And then the other just insight that I hadn't known before was, you are not your thoughts, right? You have thoughts. And before I knew that, I thought I was my thoughts because my brain was always thinking and I thought it was me. But you have to have a healthy sense of differentiating. And my therapist probably would have called that, the functioning adult. The people who trained me in spiritual direction called it the inner observer. It's just that part of yourself that can take one step back from the situation. Because you've had thoughts about your thoughts before, right? Like you have a little conversation inside yourself. Well, if you can get the healthiest version of yourself to just take one step back, you are not your thoughts. You have thoughts. And once you realize that you can look at your thoughts, now you can cooperate with what God is trying to do, or your therapist or your spiritual director, right? And your mind can continue to be renewed, because that adult version or that mature version of yourself can now notice what's going on, discern what's going on, and then respond. And that's one of the big parts of the book. There's a practice in there called NDR. It's notice, discern, and respond. And you can use that in a micro way, real quick. If you catch yourself like, oh, I don't need to be anxious right now because nothing is really wrong. Okay, I'll just drop it. But sometimes you have a really long-standing trauma. You can't just notice, discern, and respond your way out of that.
Yeah.
NDR would be a super, super, super long process in that case, right? You might be noticing it, but then the discernment process and working it through might take months or years, depending. And then you have a new way of responding. All that to say, we can cooperate with God's work in our lives, which again brings us back to the pacing. You have to believe that you have the time for that.
Well, as a final question, one of the things we've been talking about in this series and even in this conversation today is that self-awareness is a lifelong journey. So right now, how are you intentionally positioning yourself in spaces to continue catalyzing self-awareness?
Well, I still do all the things I said. Number one, I have a therapist. At this point, I have a different one. I spent some time with her a few years ago, and then I just said, well, can we keep meeting? But I'd like to meet quarterly just for a check-in. So I have a therapist. I have a spiritual director who I meet monthly with. That's going to happen the rest of my life. I will always have a spiritual director because I need someone to sit in front of me and hold space and listen well and ask me good questions so I can process. That'll just happen forever. I also have really good friends, like trusted, mature, wise friends that I can share my heart with, and they hold space with me. They don't have to fix it, but they can be with me. I think, of course, my husband, thankfully, we can have this level of conversation. So I actually am really blessed to have a lot of really great people, some of whom I pay and some who I don't. But even if you can't afford a therapist or a spiritual director, I mean, are there pastors, mentors, really good, trustworthy friends? Just, I think having someone you can talk to also really helps with your self-awareness. So I intentionally position myself with people who can journey with me. I also intentionally position myself by making plans in my calendar to participate in the spiritual practices that I think foster that inner dynamic that we're talking about. I don't just hope it's going to happen. I actually calendar, and this is going to sound crazy, but again, I'm empty nest. I calendar all my big spiritual practices a year in advance. So all of my 2025 half-day Fridays, all of my quarterly 24-hour retreats, we take a mini sabbatical in the month of July. All of that's on the calendar for the whole year already. And that's how it happens. It's really, it's not romantic. It's very sterile, but it's how
It's so intentional.
It's intentional is what it is. And when I get there, then I do the thing I know I want to do anyway, but I've already planned it out. So.
Oh, that's so good. Okay, I thought of one more question before we wrap up.
Okay.
One of the things I'm hearing you say is that self-awareness is so often cultivated within relationships. So for the person who is wanting to grow in self-awareness, where might be a good place to start within a friendship or relationship?
Yeah, well, look around. Think about all your friends that you currently have. I mean, and it could be family. I don't know how some people, they can't talk to their family at all. Maybe some people can. It just depends. Like I told you, I had a really difficult situation with my mom. I don't know that I could have had this level of but some people can. Or maybe you just have some really good friends. Or again, maybe is there a pastor? Is there a teacher? Is there someone in your life right now? Let's take the example of friend. Let's say you've got 10 or 20 friends that are kind of closer in, and you can think of one of them that you feel is the most trustworthy. Maybe they're not even the wisest. That would be great if you chose your wisest friend. But I think even more than wisdom, I would want them to be trustworthy. Because I'm going to be sharing parts of myself with someone, and I need to know that it stays right there and that they will just hold it with me. If you can think of anybody who is like that, I would just have a conversation and say, hey, you know what? I've just felt the need to have kind of deeper level conversations with somebody so I can hear myself say things out loud and grow in my own self-awareness of what I'm thinking. Because sometimes when we keep it only in our brain, it gets muddy. And I would just tell them, hey, are you interested in that kind of conversation? And then if they say yes, then just set some ground rules. Again, this is all about being intentional. If they say yes, say, that is so cool. And I'd love to do that for you too. If you want that, I'd be willing to listen to you. And then you could just go out to lunch or go sit in a park or walk in the park. And both of you just practice processing something from your life. And the other person, all they have to do is listen and empathize. To feel with, like, oh man, yeah, I hear you. You don't have to fix it. You don't have to solve it. I actually recommend no advice. Like, advice kills it. But someone who listens, who holds it with you, who feels with you, that can open you up in new ways where your vulnerability can expand. And then it just opens more and more doors, I think, to self-awareness. Yeah.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for this conversation, Gem. I'm really grateful for you and for our time together today.
Yeah, thank you so much. What a delight to speak with you, Taylor. Thanks.
Wasn't that just so beautiful? One of the things Gem said that has stayed with me is this: you are not your thoughts. Or to say this another way, we are more than our thoughts. When we can learn how to untangle and differentiate ourselves from these inner voices, they can become our teachers as we learn to listen without judgment. We will still be influenced by them, but as Gem writes in her book, Hold That Thought, we have the power to befriend, integrate, and release much of the angst that comes from allowing them to take the driver's seat. After our recording, I asked Gem one more question. What do you need to do less of? Her answer is really beautiful. I'll be including this short video in my Substack, which is a weekly resource email that I send out every Wednesday. To watch this video and hear more of my reflections on today's episode, you can subscribe through the link in the show notes. I'm so grateful that you listened to today's episode. Thank you for spending time with me. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy or through my website, taylorjoymurray.co. Also, if you enjoyed this conversation, it would mean so much to me if you took a minute to subscribe and review the podcast. This is an easy way to partner with me and is invaluable in reaching new listeners. Until next week.